Three young hikers vanished into Oregon's wilderness, and what was found a decade later would haunt investigators forever. It began as a simple summer adventure. Eric Stevens, a geology student with an easy grin and a love for the mountains, invited his friends Jonathan and Lisa on a 5-day trek through Mount Hood National Forest. They packed maps, energy bars, and the kind of optimism only youth and friendship can carry. On the morning of July 27th, they set off from Portland in Eric's old Cherokee, laughing, windows down, the horizon wide and inviting. By evening, their car sat quietly at the trailhead by Trillium Lake, keys tucked neatly beneath the tire, a familiar ritual for hikers expecting to return. But they never did. When the forest swallowed them, it left behind only silence and a mystery that would grow darker with every passing year. By the time the search began, the forest had already reclaimed the trail. What was meant to be a 5-day hike had stretched into more than a week, with no word from the students. Families called, messages went unanswered, and by the 1st of August, the cheerful photos pinned to the university notice board had begun to look like missing posters. Senior Ranger Thomas Mackenzie assembled a team of 12, joined by 6 local mountaineers who knew every bend of the Hood River trails. They fanned out through the trees at first light, their radios crackling faintly beneath the dense canopy. The air was cool, heavy with the scent of pine and wet earth. Somewhere out there, they hoped, 3 young people were waiting to be found. The first clue appeared sooner than anyone expected. Near Salmon Creek, a circle of stones marked where a campfire had once burned. Tin cans lay scattered among the ferns, still glinting under the weak Sunday. There were footprints, faint but recent, and a white sock half buried in the mud. It matched Lisa's size. Mackenzie noted each detail carefully, a hopeful sign that they had followed the right path. But as the hours passed and no voices called back, the hope began to thin like the mist rising from the creek. The next day, they found the second campsite, tucked within a clearing near a ridge of dark rock. A rope hung from a branch above, used perhaps to suspend food against animals. The ground was flattened where sleeping bags might have been laid. It looked ordinary enough until they noticed the scraps of torn fabric caught on the undergrowth. One of the volunteers held up a piece of blue nylon. It matched the color of Eric's tent. No blood, no signs of panic, just quiet disorder, as if the campers had vanished mid-routine. When they reached the 3rd marked stop at the foot of Mount Defiance, the forest changed character. The trees grew older here, the paths narrower, the silence more complete. It took an entire day to climb the slope. No fire pit, no tins, no prints. Only the wind whispering through moss and stone. By evening, they had covered 10 kilometers and found nothing. Mackenzie ordered a helicopter sweep. The chopper's blades thudded through the valley, scattering birds from the treetops, but from above there was only green upon green, endless and impenetrable. Days turned into a week. The rangers brought in dogs trained for search and rescue. The animals caught the scent briefly near the ravine and followed it uphill before losing it on the rocks. Every new lead dissolved into the same outcome emptiness. Then, on the 8th of August, one of the dogs led its handler towards a gully 2 kilometers from the mountain base. There, tangled among fallen branches, lay the shredded remains of a tent. The blue fabric was unmistakable. It had been sliced neatly, each cut deliberate, clean, almost surgical. Inside, they found a single torn sleeve, some metal tent poles, and nothing else. Nearby lay Jonathan's backpack, ripped open as though someone had searched it in haste. His notebook was still intact, the last entry written in careful student handwriting. Day 3 reached the rocks. Eric found some interesting samples. Tomorrow, we go further east. That line, written 10 years before anyone knew its meaning, became the last known trace of the 3 friends. Forensics later confirmed that the cuts in the tent were made with a sharp blade, a hunting knife perhaps. But there was no blood, no signs of a struggle, only absence. The discovery unsettled even the most seasoned rescuers. Mackenzie stood for a long while at the edge of the ravine, the evening sun catching the silver of his badge, before quietly saying that they'd move the search perimeter another 10 kilometers. As night fell, lanterns flickered between the trees like faint stars. Radios whispered static, and the forest seemed to listen. They searched every hollow, every stream, calling names into the dark that never answered back. The next morning, the site was sealed and logged as evidence pending explanation. There was, after all, nothing else to record. If the students had fallen, the terrain would have yielded their remains. If they had been attacked, there should have been signs. Yet there was nothing, no tracks, no bodies, no trace of where 3 healthy young hikers had gone. The rangers packed their gear in uneasy silence, the forest closing around them as if to erase every footprint. And as they drove back down the mountain, headlights carving through the fog, one question hung heavy in every mind. If they were attacked, where are their bodies? But what they would find, 10 years later, was beyond imagination. The forest grew quiet again after the search was called off. Autumn settled over Mount Hood, and the leaves fell where the searchers had once stood, erasing the traces of tents, footprints, and unanswered questions. The official investigation had yielded nothing, and soon the file was closed, labeled neatly, and stored among Oregon's unsolved cases. But for the families left behind, there was no such closure. Every weekend, Eric's father drove into the woods with a map on the passenger seat, tracing routes the rangers had already walked. Sometimes he brought his wife, sometimes he went alone. He learned the shape of the mountains by heart, the way the rivers curled around their stones, the smell of pine resin after rain. To him, the forest had become both a prayer and a punishment, the only place where his son might still exist, if only as a whisper between the trees. Lisa's mother, Patricia, refused to let the story fade. She pinned missing posters on petrol station boards long after they had yellowed in the Sunday. She wrote letters to local papers, to hiking clubs, even to psychics. Each time she was met with silence, a silence that felt heavier with each passing season. She began to walk with a cane, the limp a reminder of how far grief can reach into the body. Still, she kept searching. Jonathan's parents moved house, unable to bear the sight of their son's untouched room. His desk, still covered with biology notes, looked frozen in time. Friends visited at first, bringing food, condolences, promises, all of which faded as the years wore on. By the 5th anniversary, only the parents still came to the memorial by Trillium Lake. A few flowers, a candle, and the weight of unspoken questions were all that remained. The police revisited the file twice in those 10 years. Each time, they came away empty-handed. There were no new witnesses, no confessions, no strange findings washed up by the rain. The ravine where the tent had been found was overgrown now, swallowed by moss and time. Rangers still avoided that route after dusk, not out of fear, but respect, as though the forest itself demanded silence there. Hope became a kind of ritual, too. Every spring, when the snow began to melt, the families would return to the trailhead at Trillium Lake. They would stand by the parking lot where Eric's old Cherokee once sat, the same air still cool, the same mountains looming like patient giants. For a moment, the stillness felt almost sacred. By the 10th year, their voices had grown quieter. Reporters stopped calling. The posters were gone. The world had moved on except for those few who could not. In the end, the missing became stories whispered in local diners and around campfires. Some said the trio had fallen into one of the caves, others that they had met someone dangerous on the trail. But no one really knew. The mountains kept their secrets well, and somewhere beneath their slopes, beneath years of snow and silence, something waited to be found, something that would finally break the long, merciless quiet. It was a quiet spring afternoon when 3 geologists from the University of Oregon made their way through the eastern slopes of Mount Hood. The forest, thick with moss and silence, had long been forgotten by hikers. Daniel Clark, a senior researcher, was leading a routine survey on mineral deposits, accompanied by his graduate student Marcus Lawrence and technician Kevin O'Connor. They were not searching for lost hikers, nor for any trace of tragedy, only for rocks, layers, and data. But nature, it seemed, had other plans. Around 2 o'clock, Marcus spotted a narrow crevice running through a cluster of limestone boulders. It looked ordinary at first, the kind of fissure you'd step over without a thought. But curiosity, that quiet pull of every geologist, urged him closer. He clipped a rope to his harness and lowered himself in. 12 meters down, the gap widened into a small chamber, the air cold and stale, the light from his torch cutting through the dark like a knife. He called up to the others that it was clear. Then, as the beam of his flashlight swept across the cave wall, he froze. At first he thought it was an odd rock formation, 3 pale shapes fixed in a row. But when the light steadied, the truth settled in his throat like a stone. 3 skulls, human, each one impaled upon a wooden stake, turned towards the entrance, as if silently watching him. He didn't scream. He simply climbed out, pale and trembling, and told Clark, "You need to see this." The 2 men descended carefully, the rope creaking under their weight. They stood in silence, the torchlight flickering over the grisly display. The skulls were clean, almost polished, and arranged with deliberate precision, equidistant, each at the same height. The stakes themselves had been wedged into cracks in the stone. Someone had placed them there with intention, patience, and an unsettling sense of ritual. Clark, seasoned and rational, felt his stomach twist. The cave was shallow, only 4 meters wide, but it felt suffocating. "No one could have done this by accident," he murmured. They took photographs, recorded the coordinates, and climbed back to the surface, contacting the county police through their satellite phone. By evening, the site was sealed off. Detective David Miller and forensic pathologist Dr. Elizabeth Hawkins arrived, descending with ropes into the cold chamber where the 3 skulls waited. The air smelled of damp earth and age. The doctor's voice was low but steady. "All appear to belong to young adults," she said, gloved hands tracing the edges of bone. "No trauma, no decay from recent death. These have been here a long time. The stakes were made of local oak, roughly 40 centimeters long, carved by a blade. The wood was dry but not ancient, perhaps a few years old." Around the fire pit at the center of the cave, investigators found an empty tin can, a piece of rope, and the charred remains of small fires lit long ago. It wasn't the scene of a killing. It was something else. A display. A message. The DNA results arrived 2 weeks later. 100% match. Eric Stevens, Jonathan Price, and Lisa Carter. After 10 years, the forest had finally given them back, but in the most horrific way imaginable. The news broke across Oregon like a ghost resurfacing. Families wept, rangers returned to the mountains in disbelief, and journalists descended upon the woods, searching for a headline that could capture the dread of it all. But the questions only deepened. Who had taken their lives? Why such a ritualistic arrangement? Investigators examined every theory. An occult group, a deranged hermit, perhaps even a remnant of an ancient tribal practice. Dr. Hawkins consulted an ethnographer who explained that certain 19th-century tribes once displayed enemy skulls in sacred caves, but such customs had vanished more than a century ago. There were no modern groups that could have replicated it. Forensics could not determine how the students had died. No marks of violence, no bullet holes, no fractures consistent with weapons. Only one small crack on Eric's left temple, too inconclusive to name as cause of death. The bones were cleaned of all tissue, either by time or by deliberate effort. Someone had taken care to erase everything but the bones themselves. Detective Miller studied the layout carefully. The skulls were set exactly 1 meter apart, facing the cave mouth. It was mathematical, almost ceremonial. Whoever did it knew the terrain and had the skill to navigate dangerous ground unseen. They were methodical, patient, perhaps even proud of their work. Outside, as the team packed up their equipment, the last light faded behind the trees. The forest, indifferent as ever, seemed to close in again. The wind whispered through the branches, carrying with it the faint echo of something ancient and cruel. 10 years of silence had ended, but the truth, darker than anyone imagined, was only beginning to emerge. Just when everyone thought the forest had given up all its secrets, investigators stumbled upon another cave. The discovery of the 3 students' remains should have brought an ending, some fragile form of closure. Instead, it opened the door to something far larger, something that reached back even further into the wood's dark history. While cataloging nearby caves in the Mount Hood region, a team of police and volunteer cavers found another site, only 4 kilometers from the first. This cave was smaller, its entrance narrow and half hidden beneath a tangle of roots. Inside, among the dust and silence, they found scattered human bones, ribs, vertebrae, fragments of arms and legs. Time had dried them to a pale, brittle white. Mixed among them were scraps of synthetic fabric, metal buttons, and a broken zip from a jacket. When examined under the forensic lamp, one button still bore a faint manufacturer's name. It traced back to clothing made in the mid-1992. 3 weeks later, DNA results confirmed what the investigators feared. The remains belonged to the Coleman family: Roger, his wife Cindy, and their teenage son Brad, who had vanished in 1997 during a weekend hike near Mount Jefferson, 80 kilometers away. Their car had been found, but no trace of the family ever appeared. Until now. The bones told a strange story. There were no signs of violence, no fractures, no cuts or bullet marks. It was as though they had simply lain down and never risen again. Their daughter, 12-year-old Emily, was missing entirely. Detectives combed the surrounding forest for weeks, mapping every crevice and gully, hoping to find another clue, another trace of the girl. Nothing. Not a single thread of clothing, not a bone, not even an item that could have belonged to her. It was as if the forest had swallowed her whole. The similarities between the Coleman case and the student's disappearance could no longer be ignored. Both groups had vanished without a struggle. Both were later found in remote caves, and both had been placed there deliberately. The families lived in different towns, never met, never crossed paths. Yet something or someone had drawn them into the same stretch of wilderness and arranged their remains with chilling purpose. Detective Miller gathered every file from the surrounding counties, searching for other missing persons that might fit the pattern. The list was long: hikers, hunters, travelers who entered Oregon's dense forests and never returned. Most were accidents, animal attacks, exposure to the cold. But a few, 5 in total, were unresolved. Their bodies never recovered. The timeline between them painted a faint rhythm. Disappearances in 1997, 1,999, and then silence. It was as if whoever had done it had stopped, or perhaps moved on. Some believed the caves were being used by an isolated cult, one that practiced rituals long forgotten. Others thought of a single man, a survivalist, perhaps, who lived unseen among the trees, stalking strangers who dared enter his territory. There were whispers, too, of ancient tribes who once used the mountains for offerings, their traditions twisted by time and madness. None of the theories held firm. There were no fingerprints, no personal items from an outsider, no trace of human presence other than the dead. Even the wood used for the skull stakes in the first cave came from a century-old tree, cut down only a year before the discovery, suggesting someone who knew both the land and how to disappear within it. By the end of that year, the case had grown colder than ever. 2 families, 8 lives, 10 years apart, all drawn to the same shadowed mountain and left behind in silence. The deeper investigators searched, the more it seemed that the forest itself was guarding something vast, deliberate, and patient. And somewhere, perhaps beneath another layer of moss and time, one secret still waited. The fate of little Emily Coleman, the girl the mountain never returned. The funerals were quiet affairs, marked by soft rain and the sound of distant church bells. In Portland, hundreds gathered to farewell the three students whose smiling photographs had once hung on university walls. Their parents stood together, bound not by words, but by the shared weight of knowing. In Salem, the Coleman family was laid to rest beside an empty grave, one left open for Emily, the daughter who never came home. Flowers wilted, candles burned out, but the questions remained. The investigation eventually faded into the cold archives of Oregon's unsolved cases. Files were boxed, names misremembered, and the forest reclaimed its silence. Yet those who had walked among those trees never forgot. They spoke of the strange stillness that seemed to settle near the caves, of how even the birds refused to sing there. Some said the mountain was cursed, others believed it merely patient, holding on to its secrets until the world stopped asking. And so the story of Mount Hood became another whisper in the long catalogue of mysteries that defy explanation. Lives ended, but the sense of something unfinished lingers a shadow in the trees, a question that refuses to die. If you're drawn to stories like this, to the quiet terror that lies just beyond the campfire's glow, subscribe and stay with us. Because sometimes the next story isn't buried in the past at all, it's waiting, just out of sight, closer than you think.